This is Dick Dawson at April 22nd, the year 2011. We're in Green Harbor in the on Careswell and Canal Street, crossing the Church of the Assumption. And we just want to go over what the history was and how the Dawson family got to Green Harbor and the years that things started to bring the family down to Green Harbor in Marshfield, Mass. Started about 1934 when our relatives, the Hurleys, which would be my mother's sisters, it would be Annie Hurley and my mother being Alice and Charles Dawson, came down to Green Harbor, and they started by renting a home, a small home up on the hill, which is beside Cedar Hill, which is next to the Wright gas station, as we called it, which is down to our right. And Careswell Street, of course, would go over towards Brant Rock. But it all started up on the hill in 1934 where they rented. And then later, as time goes on, they rented down into the Green Harbor section. This area has some of our relatives. To the left, completely across the street, you'll see a small home in the wood. That was owned by John Donovan. That was the head of the Boston homicide unit in charge of the DeSalvo slaying and murders in the early probably 1945s or 50s in that area. He solved that case, and he used to spend many a time walking Green Harbor Beach trying to figure out. They were relatives of the Dawsons by marriage through the Hurleys, and John just passed away just recently. And from here we'll go to our next stop, which will be going up towards the Marshfield Center area of the Winslow House. On Careswell Street, going by what was known in our day as the Cedar Hill gas station, owned by Wright, who was a plumber and also owned the gas station. He lived up above, and his work was done on the right. Now, right to this next section, right here, this was the cleaners, and then this section here was the restaurant. It was boil cleaners and the pantry shelf. And now as we continue on Careswell to Duxbury, we're coming up to Camp Cedar Crest, which was a camp that many youngsters went to out of Malden. Probably 200 at the one time in the summer. It was all little stucco houses with a bare floor on the ground of nothing more than mud with the cots. On the left, as we're approaching now, was Dr. McLaughlin's famous office in there, that big white house, and that was the chicken farm before he bought it. But he was the doctor for the town of Marshfield, and he had very poor manners on how he kept it clean. Now we're on Careswell Street at the Winslow House, corner of Webster Street. This in the 50s was famous for itself in those days. It was a very unique home in Marshfield. We went on our own tour in here. We just went to the kitchen and got our knife and opened those French doors and took our own tour through here. But I remember being in here with the cement floors made of brick, and rather unique in itself with the way that it was made. And still is a famous landmark in Green Harbor, the Winslow House. We're now in the back of the Winslow House on Careswell Street. This is something we just want to point out. These French doors were here back in the 1950s, and this board wasn't here though at that time, because you were able to put the knife in between these and raise up the lock, and we went in and we had our own private tour. There was no charge and nobody to bother, and we took our time. So I just wanted to point out some of the history of this building itself in Green Harbor, Mass.
And who was we?
Let's see, that's good, Paula, to ask that question. It would be Charlie and Jane and maybe some of the people that lived in our area that came at that time, but I know we'd do that. We were very unique in how we could do our own tours down Green Harbor. Now we're heading up toward Marshfield Center, on Webster Street. We're just going by Senate's Farm, which has been a landmark right here on the right, where that white car is. And they'd go up and loop around there and sell the vegetables right where the stump is on that hill. And that was owned by the Senates, which was a very famous people in town. They owned the Senate Oldsmobile, the Senate Farm. The chief of police was Frank Sennett, that lived across the street from that farm we just went by. Now we're heading up towards the senior citizen of today. But this was Daniel Webster's house originally in here, where they had many sporting events for the people that lived in Marshfield on a particular holidays.
Should I turn in here or the next one?
Yeah.
I better turn it in.
Okay, that's all.
Are we done?
Are we done there?
All set. Yep.
We're heading down on Canal Street now, going towards Elmhurst, which is 2 or 3 more streets down. And the history here is that in the early 1940s there was a stable there, and this was called the Sunland section of Green Harbor. And the stables were where you could rent horses, which my father and Charlie and Jean would go, and you'd ride them on the beach. I don't know what you'd pay for them to get them, but the stable was down Elmhurst, which we're approaching right now, and it was straight ahead, right to the curve, where these blue houses are now, with the dark blinds. But that is where the stable was, where you come up, and people would just walk up here, and they'd rent the horses and then go towards the beach, and it was very convenient. But this spot here is right where the horses were in those days, and that was the spot that I recall.
Do you want to show the picture, Paul?
Now we're on Careswell Street at the ranch house, which was probably built around 1935 or 40. About 1942, they had a tremendous fire here, which burned 2/3 of the building, mainly from the ranch house time down through here. And at that time, the roof was burnt off, and it was quite a fire. What I remember most about this was there was the cigarette machine here on the right, which would be right over on this side. And in it, we broke open that cigarette machine because it had cigarettes in it with 2 cents in each cellophane. And the cost of cigarettes in those days were 20 cents. So we kept the 2 cents, left the cigarettes, and thought we made out pretty good. But that's the history of here. On Monday night, Mrs. Hayes, Frank Hayes, lived across the street, and his wife, they were very nice to the neighborhood. And they'd have all the children in the neighborhood in the Green Harbor section come up here, and you'd have free movies on Monday night from 7 to 9. And I always remember the orange crush bottles. They were short, heavy, very dark, and it was a very different orangeade than you'd have today, made by Simpson Spring up around Abington. But that then at the same time next door would go was what we call the Moonbeam. And the Moonbeam was a place owned by Doc Mooney's son, who was a sports writer for the Boston Globe. A very good sports writer that just lived down the street. And the Moonbeam would have ice cream and candy, and it had 2 little apartments on the left. The people that owned it would be in there, and they'd run it, live in it, and it would change hands very much. Later became a package store, and I don't recall the name, but it was a package store that sold beer and wine, because I always remember half and half of beer, the quarts. You'd get 3 quarts of beer in those days for $1. It was just that was a very small store in this section of Green Harbor. We're now at the bridge in Green Harbor as you go by the ranch house. And this bridge, in those days there wasn't any telephones in the cars. There was no way to know when anybody was coming. But my father would come down on Wednesdays and Fridays. And Jean was older, so I think it would be Charlie and I would sit on this bridge and and wait for him to come. And because we hadn't seen him now for a couple of days, and we would ride from here to the house on Kentucky Street. Also point out, as you can see, the creek today has collapsed. The both sides probably showing only about 8 feet in width. In the 40s, this was wide open. In fact, I bought a boat from somebody over in this cottage here. Tilly's their name were. And I paid $25 for it. But when I put it in the creek, it sank. But there was plenty of water. And this creek would go from here up to Beach Street, which was all the way up to where today would be Burke's Beach. So at high tide, you could go through this creek without any problem. Now we go over to just one end here. You'll see a part of a house sticking out. That house was started to be built in the 40s, and they must have ran out of money because there was no doors, there was no windows, there was a roof. And as young boys, we would play in that house and hang around it. And it was safe, but it was only about 1/3 built. And from there on, someday somebody bought it and fixed it up and lived in it. Also on this bridge, I remember having Babe Dickerson, which was the best woman athlete in the United States, one of the best golfers and female athletes, go by here and wave to us in their Cadillac. Julius Boris, one of the best golfers, again, at the Gurnett Inn, which is down in Gurnett Road. He lived here, and he was married to the Cosgrove, and they owned the inn, and they originally out of Southern Pines, I think, in North Carolina, but they'd come up from the summer. But this is what I remember with this bridge in the 40s, and brings back some good memories. And the female athlete, again, I can remember the big Cadillac and the big car, and she'd go by, because she'd always be playing golf. And we'd fish off here also. Behind me, where the car is in the White House, there was a family named Laughlin. They owned the liquor store in Dorchester. And what I remember, I made a trade with the son. I don't know what I gave him, but the folks would have killed me at the time. But I ended up with a real German holster and a hat, a real German hat. And that I had it for many years. But you just learn a lesson, whether it's in sports or World War II, or no matter what it was. As I was telling my grandchildren the other day, hang on to it, because someday that will be worth something. Because I have letters like from Tom Lasorda. Today to the grandchildren, they mean nothing. He was the manager of the the Los Angeles Dodgers. They were looking at him the other night, and they thought they wanted copies. But no matter what you get, whether it was funny books or beer cans, a friend of mine has thousands of dollars in beer cans from the 50s. Save them, and someday the lesson I learned was that German holster will be worth something. The original foundation, look at this guy. Kentucky Street Market. See the mountains right through it. Now we're in front of my father, Charlie Dawson, bought this house in approximately 1939 or 40 for $3,000. Bought it from a person named Hennessy at Belmont. We previously had rented across the street, and we moved in to this, probably in the 40s. And the different things in the house here that stand out would be the center of the walk here, which we built ourselves with my father in probably 1940 with the cement we put in, set the small stones on the beach, and made the circle with a metal basket. And it's amazing, all these years later, which you figure now we've gone probably 50, 60 years, the cement has still stayed. And the original walk is here. This was made from the beach. These rocks were brought up from the beach. That was here when we bought the house. That we didn't do. From there, we're going to go down on the side here of the house, just some of the neighbors that lived here. There was Doherty on the right. He was the assessor for the city of Boston. He would have a party about every other Saturday night that would drive Gene crazy. You knew you were in trouble when they brought in the piano from the ranch house about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then you knew we were going to go big time at night. He could do Curly in the face on the barroom floor. He could mimic Curly. He could mimic Cardinal Cushing. He was just one of the funniest party guys you have. Gene didn't think it was too impressive, and Charlie or I didn't either. But Gene's room was up on the right. Charlie's was in the back, and I was safe. I was on the other side of the house. But a lot of money changed hands in the back of this house here. That room was the card playing room. There'd be Doherty, there'd be Bill McCarty, Judge McMiniman, McCarty owned the ice cream, and they'd play cards all night. And they'd go into some big games. They're very influential people, though, that you met on down in this area. A different type of people in different businesses. They were all your friends. There was no problems, no trouble of any way. So it was always a great neighborhood to have. As we say, the line is, the house next door was Marshfield. This is Duxbury. And it was just a nice neighborhood to have. One thing that always stand out in my mind, the house on the left, which was known on to this house, was the Barretts. And I was young, and I remember when they delivered the telegram from the son being killed in France in 1944. I was sitting on the front steps here, and we knew what was going on. Later in life, some of their relatives were friendly with General Sweeney, who flew them. It was the pilot for the atomic bomb that they dropped in Hiroshima later on in the war that stopped the war. We got to know him. He was just a regular person. The big thing of the story he always talked about was he didn't think he had enough gas to get back for himself and the plane back to the carrier that they'd come off with the bomb. And that was something that house next door, owned now by the Loys, it's just something that you'll always remember. The parents never came back to the house. And now we're on the left side of the house on Kentucky Street. And this deck wasn't there. There was 4 windows at this side. My room was up on the left. This tree was there even in the original time that we were here. It was an oak tree, and I know Paula said she used to ride on it, and swings, I used to. And this was just all been filled in since the years that we were here, but this is the way that it is today on here. Behind me now is the rear of the Dawson house in the 40s, and we have the famous stairs where Paula Dawson, in those days, not Paula Partridge, came down those stairs, and I think she had every stair with her back. We had 900 Band-Aids on her, and my mother and I were the only ones here, but she really took a fall because she came down the whole group of stairs that were there. And we finally got her fixed up and quieted down, and she enjoyed the rest of her vacation. Now up on the top right, that was Charlie's room, Charlie Dawson's room. And then there was the doors going out to the porch. And the porch was only screened in those days. And then in the front left here, as we're looking at it, was Gene's room. and my parents were over on the other side, and mine was in the front, on the left, coming from the street. But Paula's father, who's doing the filming, he built the cement through the cellar because that was all clay. There was nothing there at that time but clay. And he also built the shower because when we moved here, there was no such thing as a hot water tank. There was no such thing as an ice refrigerator. You bought the cubes of ice. You also had no hot water. So if my father wanted to shave to go to work, he'd heat the water in a pan and then go upstairs and with a little bit of hot water would shave. Then we got a lot of money some years later, maybe 3, 4 years later, and we could afford a hot water. Nobody had phones here. Nobody had hot water in any of these houses. Nobody had refrigerators. So this is the way you live from it. The big house that Paul is looking at now there was not there. That was some type of a conservation easement or something. You couldn't build on it. And then over, if you can turn around slowly, Paula, over where the trees are over here, that was the backyard of the McCartys. And that was a clay tennis court where you'd put down the tapes and we'd all play tennis. And you'd have to roll the court, maintain it, but it was actually the right size of a tennis court, which backed up to the garages and the houses over on the waterfront there.
Can I ask you a question? How are you?
In my hand I have a picture. This would be of my father, Charlie Dawson, and then my brother, Charlie Dawson, and Gene Dawson. And this is taken in front of this house about 1941, 42, when they'd rent the horses that we previously talked about up at Sunland, and they'd actually be on their way to the beach. This was a black and white originally, but now he had it made at the best you could do into the colors. So this is taken right in front. There was no house across the street. That was just an open field. And that's how this picture that they have happens to come about. The house across the street to your left, you want to do that?
Yep.
To the left, that was a house my father rented about 1939. And that was all set on sand, complete sand, cedar posts, nothing else. And a little carpenter up in Marshville Center built it. But it was always a nice house, unique house, and that's where they lived when they saw this house for sale. Up in the house farther to the left of that was all woods. And now we'll go further down the street and go from here down into what was known as the McCartys. Had 2 houses. One was the house, and then Dr. McBain owned the carriage house that we're going to go by now. Now we're going to proceed to our next stop, Howell. Now we're in front of which McBain's garage in our day. And it was the living quarters for the maids and the help that Dr. McBain had on the other side of the hospital. And the upstairs had rooms, and the bottom had massive garage doors. And there was like a couple of surreys that would be the type that you could sit in with benches and have horses pull them. And there was also very expensive carriages that horses would pull. Well, the McBains would go home after Labor Day, and we'd get our knife out again that we mentioned up at the Windsor house, and we'd just clip the door. And I would always be a rider, but my brother Charlie and Gene and some of the McCartys would take the surreys and take them right down the street, back and forth by pulling them, and give the younger children rides. And then we'd put them back nice and neat and shut the doors, and that would be the end of it. But this was then bought by Billy McCarty and Francis McCarty, and they were all related to Cardinal Spellman. and great friends of the Dawsons through life, and Eddie and the whole group. Eddie lived in the house on the left with his mother, his two sisters. There was Julia Ann, there was a nun at Regis, in charge of the music department. His sister Margaret, that was also at Regis, in charge of the psychology department. I have at home some of the original scoops from the McCarty's ice cream that sell for like $50 to $100 because they're not like the ones today. And they're things that they gave me probably about 1940, 41. The McCarty's ended up selling ice cream in the Tedeschi markets and also all over the South Shore. A very good family, and they're still around Marshall. Now we're heading towards the beach on the path that we used to cut through near the houses to reach the ocean. But as you came down this street, which is an extension of Plymouth Ave, Duxbury, it was all woods here, completely woods, and there were two houses up in the hill here, and they were owned by the Holmes and the Hawkins. But in between them was woods and a small house that must have been built like 1850, that you could just open the doors and go in, and there were like, I remember old blankets and clothes, but nobody appeared to own it and nobody appeared to ever come to it. Eventually somebody bought that land. So now we'll continue down more, and we'll look on the left here. If you can go to the left side here, there's some tennis courts. They were in the association of the people here, and they've been fixed up through the years, as you can see with the basketball courts. And they've, we spent hours in there, but we didn't play tennis. I learned to play baseball in here. You could hit the ball over the fence. That was a home run, and we'd take the nets down, and we'd have a ball field in there, which did make the people very happy in the neighborhood, but this was the way that we'd use it. And it wasn't as well kept. See, every house on the waterfront had a garage, and the garage was where the people that worked for them, there was a lot of money in the waterfront, and they lived above those garages, and they either had old automobiles or they had carriages of some type that would be pulled by horses. Eventually they took these garages and made them into houses. Now we'll continue down farther. We're now looking at the Webster Island in memory of Ralph and Madeline Tedeschi. Now the Tedeschis bought the Rocks house, which we're going to go there before, but Ralph was probably one of the original brothers that owned Angelo Markets in Rockland. And Ralph and his wife bought the Rocks house and eventually put which seemed so strange in those days, a swimming pool in with the ocean 20 feet in front of you. But you couldn't have met a nicer person or a nicer family than the Tedeschis. Every Sunday they'd have open house. They'd bring the trucks down from the market, and they'd have an open bar, and they'd have open roast beef, sandwiches. He even invited the Italian Navy here one time. They couldn't speak English, and the girls around Green Harbor couldn't speak Italian, and somehow they had a good time. But Ralph was a good person to know, and good for the neighborhood. We're down now at the end of Kentucky Street, and it shows the path that we used to go through to the beach. And there was just two paths with the right-of-way next to Whitman's or Killian's or York's house. This was a right-of-way next to those names that I mentioned, that they had to let the people in this neighborhood go through their land to the beach. And this was one of the paths that will connect on the other side.
All right. On the center.
All right, I'll pick up here, Paul. Tell me when. Now we're looking at the house, which was owned by Whitman, and he had a lot of servants and people that worked for him. He also owned the garage across the street, which was storing the carriages, and that was owned by, that's where the people that worked for him lived. That was later bought or willed to Joe Collins, who was friendly with these people. And at the same time, Paula and Janet and Mike, their family rented it later in life. But this was the Whitman house. Then it was owned by Dr. York. And Dr. York had 12 children, he had 2 marriages. One of them is Jerry York, that's now the coach at Boston College in hockey. We were friendly with all our family, and they were the ones we were friendly with. We'd be in that house for different things. There's 1 million rooms in this house. And then a person that owned a lot of nursing homes bought it. I don't recall his name, but his brother drowned up in the Green Harbor Yacht Club one night. He fell off the pier. And from then it was taken over by Killian. Now Killian's uncle was a Monsignor in Malden or Medford, and he bought it, and Killian died. Killian's son now, I think, could be the owner, the last that I heard. But it had never been taken care of, this house, since those years, since Dr. York owned it. Now behind me we have the right-of-way path in my day. To anybody that lived in these houses here, Mr. Whitman, not Dr. York, left in the registry of deeds that this is a right-of-way for the people that live in the horseshoe, as we call it. So now we'll walk through the path and just go to the deed. Now as we approach the beach, where I'm standing now was all sand, maybe up to my waist when I was young. And in this depth of sand, which extended off this hill, as you see, there's no seawall here. But in my day, the seawall on Paula's left, where this pole is, right here, if you can turn around, Paula, completely to your left, that was completely covered. We'd go down to a hill there to the beach. That would go down, and then we'd all put our chairs there. The thing that's happened through the years here is the beach is sunk. This beach has got lower and the sand's been sucked out, whether it's for what goes on in the channel of sucking out the sand. But you couldn't believe it. At our day, we would actually have a regular baseball game with a hard ball with maybe 18 people. The sand was so hard at low tide. You couldn't do that today because the tide doesn't go out far enough. And then the other thing that's very impressive is that during World War II, where I'm standing, the U.S. Army or the government put sandbags, and the sandbags would make foxholes. Maybe 50 bags would be into the ground, and they always were watching for the ships. And there was air raid wardens, they were called air raid wardens, and they'd watch out for the lights in the ship. In the houses on the waterfront, including our own, you had to have black shades. They had to be shades that you could not see through. So that would keep the light, so if any planes or any boats, you had to keep your headlights painted halfway down like a half moon, and you had to make sure that they were only half strength to drive around Marshfield and Green Harbor. So those are some of the things that went with World War II, and how we living so close on the ocean had to be careful of what you were doing, and these laws you had to obey. Marshfield police would stop any car and give you a ticket. It didn't have the lights done right, and you had to have these dark, heavy black shades in the house at night. As we go beyond the big house that we've been talking about, we come to Eddie Doherty's house. That's the Doherty Funeral Home people in Dedham and Needham. On that house, that was owned by Dr. McBain. And Dr. McBain, you remember, was the one that had the horses, carriages over on Kentucky Street where we'd take the Surreys out. So this was his house at that time. That was Billy McBain, who was nice to me when I was growing up. One of the few people in Green Harbor that had a boat. He had a boat in that job. He'd take me out on his boat. And Billy was as nice as you can meet. I met them probably just before they got married, Billy and his wife. He rented it later in life. Maury McDermott with the Red Sox rented it. Don DiMaggio. Joe DiMaggio came here. I saw Don, I saw McDermott. And they say Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio were here one weekend. Because as you know, at that time, Joe was married to Marilyn. If you go beyond their house on the waterfront, you'll come to another house. That was owned by Ellie Adler's brother-in-law. That house, for some reason, burnt down maybe in the 70s or so. And then farther on, the big house there, the biggest house you can see in the camera now, was owned by the Eversons. And the Eversons, they had a beautiful lawn. I learned to play baseball on that lawn and field ground ball because they weren't here all summer. And they were definitely not here in September. So in September, we'd go down there and we would play ball on the lawn there. And the strange thing, last night I got an email from my son Jay that he was teaching somebody at Fidelity, and it turned out to be my friend Donovan that we play ball with. It was his grandchild that Jay is teaching, but I haven't heard from him in a long time. And just heard from him last night on an email. But then when we get down on the street farther, we'll go to Tedeschi's and Rock's. And Tedeschi's bought it from a company, people in New York named Rock. And that's why there's so many rocks around there and so many stone walls. Their name was Rock. They haven't paid, they just hooked up. We're now standing on Bay Ave where it intersects with Beach Street. Behind me we have Bob Galvin, the attorney that I grew up with. His is his house here, his big house here. And on the left was in my day a Remian house. Now, behind me where Galvin's house was also known as Blanchard's and Chips, and there was one other, Lally's. But that was an ice cream parlor in the front. And up above was rooms with a big porch, and people would live up there. On the left was a miniature First National store. And this was like a corner store where you would come and get a lot of minor things like the general store farther. It was probably one of the few places in town that there was a phone booth. Now remember, not everybody had phones here in the 40s. So my father in business, to call his office, would have to come up to the phone booth here, or he'd use the one at the general store. And everybody used this phone. You'd have to wait in line in the summer because, again, there was no other contact. Very few people had sold. I also remember people that owned this house being in a card game, person down the street, they lost their house in the card game. Now as we turn around where the cars are here, we're now coming to the area which in the 1940, 1944, this was called the Green Harbor Inn. And this was an inn which was for food, and it was also had rooms. Well, it didn't make much money. And the person that owned it thought the best thing to do was to light it on fire. So he lit it on fire on Christmas Eve, poured the gasoline, and got killed in the parking lot. I remember it blew up. And we have pictures of that and articles on it. So then his son, Billy Burke, built a small bar and an ice cream parlor in the front that actually went right to the street. And then the ice cream parlor was there for years with the bar in the back. That also had a right of way to the beach, which became the parking lot for any of the people here where you had to pay in Marshfield to go to. If you turn around completely, Paula, take your time. We're going over towards the area of Jack's Lobster Pond. And that was owned by Mr. Jackson and his wife and the daughter Barbara that married Scott later on in life, and they ran that for years. To the left of it would be the bridges that people would jump off to. You see the 1963 Paula?
Yep. Okay.
And then we have Jackson's on the right. And one thing in the 1963, that's the year this bridge was built. My mother and father happened to be down here, whatever time of the year, I don't know. And they ended up being the first car to go over the new bridge. Because for maybe like 6 months to a year, you could only approach Green Harbor by the white bridge we talked about over at the near the ranch house. Now, as we look into the left side of this bridge, on these poles over here was a gift shop. That was always on poles, and you always wondered just how long that was going to last. And as you can see, that is a piece of property, as far as I know, and it is a deeded lot. But again, it's all gone off those pillars, and you just can't put anything on there in the building codes. As you know, down the end, they haven't had the building codes approved for noises boathouse down the end of Bay Ave, which goes into the harbor. And that's been over 3 years for that, to try to get that even started, because a friend of mine's son bought that out of Washington, named Bob Gray. But off this bridge was a diving board, and at high tide, all the kids in Green Harbor would sit on this and jump off it, and it was quite a gathering place. But this was the danger. The bottom of this here was dredged in those days fairly well, but it was loaded with people's old bed, bikes, and you went in there and you didn't know how far you were going to go down. And I know Charlie Dawson and myself would go off here, and you'd think it was good at high tide, but when you think of it today, how far down did you go in relationship to what was there as far as beds or steel items? As I mentioned over in the other bridge, this is the end of the creek that you could go in near the bridge near the ranch house and come right through the creek, which is over here to the left, and you could come right here, go under the bridge, and go out to the ocean without any trouble. Now, if you can put the camera straight down Beach Street. Beach Street had no houses. Beach Street had a white fence. It was marshland. It had to be all filled in, and we always wondered how would you ever put houses there. But all this land here has been filled in land. Jack's the lobster place, all the way down to the end, which was the barber shop on the right, on the corner, where Charlie and I would get our haircuts. That was Abuzazi. That was a heck of a name, but that's where we'd get our haircuts as you head up Marginal Street towards the general store. But all this has been filled in, and you wonder how they ever did it. Both sides, even the streets, it was all marshland. Today you probably couldn't do it with the wetland acts to do anything like that. And there was a radio station out there down there where the church road was. Down in the end was the Catholic Church, the Church of the Assumption, which was set on fire probably 25 years ago or more, and somebody burnt that down. Now there's houses. Go 4 or 5 houses down the Assumption Road, which is up here on the left, and you'll see a colonial house. Well, that's the spot where the church was in those days. Charlie used to sweep the church for $5 a weekend. That was a pretty high price, we think, to pay him, but that's what he was doing for us. That's about the completes it here of it, the things that were on. But remember, there were no houses on either side of this street until you get close to Marginal Street, probably 2 or 3 before. It's all filled in land. Another thing that we won't film is there's a bank in on the way to Brant Rock and a donut shop. which is just before the Green Harbor Yacht Club. That is all filled in land from about 100 feet in the corner. Green Harbor Yacht Club filled in, all where the boats are stored, that's filled in. So it's amazing what was filled in those times. There was only a very small number of boats around at that time. And of course, that's just about completes everything on this area. Across the bridge we have the Green Harbor Lobster Pond, and this was owned in my day by Mr. Jackson, but then Fred Scott married the daughter, Barbara. And Fred was a friend of Charlie's and I through life. Fred had an advantage, he could help you lose money in town. Fred had the jockeys living in the left there on those apartments from the Marshfield Fair. And I know Charlie and I would always stop in there to get the tips for the fair. Well, with two funny things. One day I went in there and his wife Barb was making lobster rolls. And Fred says, wait a second, so we had to wait till Barbara got out of the room, and Fred opened the cash register, and then he looked left and she wasn't there and Barbara wasn't on the right, so he took a fistful of money, gave it to Charlie and I. Charlie thought he'd need more money, so on the way up to the Marshfield Fair, Charlie stopped at the bank in Marshfield Center. He went in and got more money, and we were all set. But it was typical. We never did very well up there, no matter what was going on at the Marshfield Fair. There'd always be a problem. But we tried this day. We took all the money out of the Green Harbor Lobster Pond, and Charlie filled both pockets, and we didn't end up too well, okay? As we look across the marsh, now straight ahead we see a pink house on the right with a tree in front of it. That's the Regan cottage. That's where Pat Dawson's relatives lived. They lived there for many years, but I never saw her there in life. I met her later in life. To the left of it, we have the tallest house. That's owned by DeTulio. He put the tallest peak up. There was a game over there who could put the tallest one at times. But just next on the other side of that were two cottages, the Avona and the home side. And my father rented those for the complete summer at different times. The total cost, I know, was like $300. They were so new and so out of whack, there was no curtains in the place. So my father had to do one thing, was go buy curtains, because at night you just had complete glass and it was just kind of strange. One thing there that we always remember is Charlie had a salute, and he got it going and lit underneath the porch and set the porch on fire in one of them, either the Avona or the home side. In those days, the Dawsons thought they must have had some money, because my father paid to have a state girl come from like the home for people that, you know, would be like they'd been in trouble with the courts. And she'd live with us and take care of me for a month. And we had two different ones in the summer. And he'd bring them down, and how you trust them in the house with 3 children. But they were called like state maids, something like that. But they'd live with us, and they'd take care of us. And I remember them, I didn't like them. And they were taking care of me. I might have been 4 or 5. But that goes with the Avona home side and all the people over there. We mentioned before, Bay Ave was the first street that the folks rented towards the beach, and they rented like across from Schofield's, which were the houses with the porch on the top and the bottom, and we rented those houses. In Schofield, there was a law that you couldn't build on. So what they did there was they moved in the turret, the top of a submarine, and put that on the land. So they didn't build it, they put it on. Then they brought in a trailer house. They didn't build it, they dragged it in. And he got around the terminology of doing that, and eventually tore down the turret, tore down the lid, put a little here, a little there, and eventually they got so they could build on the land. But that's an interesting street, Bay Ave, through the years. And that's where we were when the war ended. they had the parades down here in 1945, I think, and everybody came down and they marching all over the street. But Bay Ave was always a good street and a lot of history to it, a lot of good people, a lot of politicians that lived here and judges, people that would always help us through life and anything, usually could solve many problems. I did that. Now we're at the end of the dead end on Bay Ave, and we're heading out towards the harbor over near Burke's Beach, as you can see by the flag on the left jetty. Now, when I was young, there was nothing to swim from one jetties to the other, because you'd be over in the end of Blackman's Point, and you could go over into Brant Rock. So a lot of us would be able to swim that area, and we'd had no trouble going from one end to the other. I brought my friend from Rosendale down one time, Tony Lovetier. We were probably supposed to be in school, and he had my father's bathing suit on, and I actually pulled him out. He couldn't make it, and I grabbed him by the suit in the back of his neck and pulled him back to the land. And to this day, I still see Tony. He says the only reason I saved him was we had my father's bathing suit involved and didn't want to get involved with that. But the harbor always was a problem of filling in, and they've dredged it many times, and they wonder whether some of the change in the sand is going out to the beach. Because remember I told you we used to play baseball on the beach with a hardball and actually play it on the beach, because the beach had so much sand and so much hard sand, and the water never went to the wall. It always was probably 30 feet from hitting the wall on the Bay Ave area, at least 30 feet with fine sand. So as we come in the harbor, you'd come in here and there was only Noises, which is behind me, the boathouse here. This just sold for about $850,000, and they still haven't got the permits from the town right, and they're not letting them build on it. But this was where you'd rent a boat, $2 for the day for a dory. They were gray and red, and as you can see the condition of this, they want to build it. They want to build a big house here worth a lot of money, and they're just having problems with the town. None of these boats were here. The pier wasn't here. Taylor Marine wasn't here. None of that was here. It was just all complete land. Now, if we look over here at the house with the porch, that was owned by Bob Habel, a friend of mine who owns the general store today. But Bob lived that, and I think he lived in there for quite some time. He loved the ocean, and he loved he always had a boat. Bob always had a boat. So again, as we go across this harbor, we come into Brant Rock, and we come to Blackman's Point, and people have the right to the land over there, where even this summer in 2011, they'll be putting their trailers, and they got after the contractor that tried to build over there. But Blackman's Point was always a famous place in Brant Rock and Marshfield, Mass. That's about it for over here. We have Brant Rock off to the left. That brings it at the end of our history of Green Harbor from approximately the year 1935 up to 2011. And as we can see out farther, you can see the boat has the name on it, Green Harbor. And it's interesting of what this has developed. A person named Carl Nielsen that I knew in Rosendale, again, you go back to how this harbor developed. You go up to where the bank is on the Dyke Road. He had a gas station there, and that's all that was there. And I used to see him, he's died now, but if he ever knew what it developed, the filling in of the land, the boats, the number of boats that are in here, and he's worked so hard at the gas station. And later on, his wife owned a little lobster pound next door, and it was called Pat's Lobster Shop. And she would make lobsters and sell them out of a bowl, lobster salad. And the thing is, nobody looked ahead. of all of us that were around here to see what could develop, such as the Green Harbor Yacht Club, the land, all the boats, the tuna that comes in there. It was just nothing but water. It was all just like we have out here. So that completes our tour. It's the truth, like it would.